Okay, I think we can go ahead and get going. Thank you for joining us for today's NCARB live webinar. We're going to talk about NCARB by the numbers today. Me, Andy, and Catherine are all very deeply involved in the development of NCARB by the numbers each year, and we're really excited to share it with all of you. So even though this is a webinar, we hope you'll treat today's webinar like a conversation, and feel free to drop your questions in the chat at any time, and we're going to try to answer as many as we can as we go. So first we'll introduce ourselves and talk a little bit about our roles when it comes to NCARB by the numbers. I'm Jenny Kowecki. I am on our marketing and communications team at NCARB, and I have helped write the content and narration for this data publication for the past several years. Catherine, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure, thanks. Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining. So I'm Catherine Matthews. I'm our Assistant Vice President for Data and Analytics here at NCARB. I've been here almost 5 years, so I help with preparing the data for NCARB by the numbers. I do want to give a shout out to my team, Amber Gershman in particular, who helped this year tremendously with kind of preparing some exciting new visuals, which we'll get to see in a little bit. So hello, Andy.
Hi, everyone. My name is Andy McIntyre. I'm the VP of Marketing and Communications at NCARB. I've had the pleasure of working on MBTN for several years, really, since I joined in 2013. NCARB by the numbers originated in 2011, and I'll talk a little bit about sort of its history. But we talk about it, we sort of started to talk about it as a publication, but maybe that's not the way we want you to think about it, right? It's really a resource and a sort of wealth of information. And, you know, let me just, before we get there, let me just say that, you know, my role has changed over the years, but very much it's now about sort of thinking about where do we go? Where do we want to explore? What's the sort of strategy and the next steps for NCARB by the numbers? And because it's very much been a project that has evolved over time. And every year, we get to ask ourselves this question about what do we want to do differently? Where do we want to go a little bit deeper? You know, what are the unanswered questions that we raised last time out? So it's something that I think we feel has been really useful as a sort of cornerstone for NCARB generally, in terms of how we talk about the profession and our insights that we can share internally and with other organizations and others in the profession too. But let's dig in, Jenny, shall we? Talk a little bit about NCARB by the numbers. So it is a publication. It is a resource. Now, I know that we obviously want you to stay on the webinar and not sort of multitask and go and have a look at our URL, but I will tell you that if you want to go and explore the current edition of NCARB by the numbers, it's ncarb.org/NBTN 2022. We're all for acronyms at NCARB, as you know. So NBTN is our sort of reference for NCARB by the numbers. If you do go to the site, what you'll see is the sort of image on the right is reflective of that homepage, and it really sort of gives you a sense of the different topic areas that we've studied in the last 12 months and allows you to dig in and explore in those particular areas. So I mentioned it's our annual data publication. It really does highlight key trends in the profession of architecture. And I think just some context pieces for everybody to sort of get on a page at the start. We are fortunate as an organization to have great information and great data on how people are progressing along the path to licensure. We are unique in that position through the NCARB record. And several years ago, we really started asking ourselves the question of what are we doing with this data, how are we sharing it, and how are we leveraging it to better understand how people are progressing towards licensure. And through that, we can then hopefully shape our own programs, inform ourselves about our decision making, and make us and others more informed decision makers going forward. It's also worth pointing out that certain key pieces of data, like, for example, demographic information on people on the path, is self-reported. So it's not universal. We don't require everybody to give us information on gender or race, ethnicity, but it's something that people typically have opted to do. We have around, I think, 90% of individuals, ballpark, I might be a few percentage points off, of people who do tend to report demographic information. So it's pretty robust, and it really has allowed us to dig in some topic areas that are really front and center for the architect profession at the moment. And hopefully we can help inform and shape some of the narrative in that space. It allows us to explore sort of program completions and how people are progressing through our core programs, the AXP and the ARE. That's been really important for us. And also understanding the impact and the, shall we say, how different educational paths transition through the licensure path, and also to dig in a little bit at the jurisdictional level and see if there's any differences or differentials between different parts of the country and how candidates are progressing from different geographical locations. It's important for us to also stress that we use the data in aggregate. What that means is no individual's data is accessible and identifiable. Everything is sort of a conglomerate of the swath of data we have across our database, so that we are able to report averages and collective information too. I think I'm going to pass it on to Jenny. Tell us about why we share information on NBTN.
Yeah. And I think, Andy, you already touched a little bit on some of this, but it's one of our core values at NCARB to be open. So to our customers and the public and our membership, we want to provide openness and transparency into what we're doing, how we're doing it, how people are progressing through our programs. And from an internal perspective, we also just want to make sure that we're making strategic decisions that are prompted by data and metrics and measurable things, and not just kind of blindly going where we want. So we use data from NCARB by the numbers to help us make those strategic decisions and to inform changes to our programs and services based on what we're seeing. We also use it as kind of an architecture community awareness building opportunity. So by doing things like talking about demographics in the profession and attrition on the path to licensure, we can raise awareness for the whole profession of where there might be challenges and opportunities that everyone can help address. So that's kind of our motivation for sharing NCARB by the numbers.
So I know Andy talked a little bit about what's in NCARB by the numbers, but I just want to kind of spell out a few pieces. So when we say that we gather the data from NCARB records, what we're really talking about is, in addition to the demographics and those pieces, we're looking at the interaction with the programs on the path to licensure. So the experience program, the AXP, and the examination component, the ARE. These are two very sort of data-rich areas for us that give us a lot of insight into what it looks to go from wanting to be an architect to being an architect. And so those kind of form like one of the strongest through lines in NCARB by the numbers. And we look at not just kind of like big picture, how many people did this, how many people did that, but try to kind of infer those experiential pieces, right? So like, how long does it take someone to get through this component of the path? And maybe looking at different things, trying to get a sense of what the experience is with the programs, which, like my colleague said, kind of feeds back into decisions around how we shape these. So yeah, lots of things. I think we can dig in a little bit on what we're looking at here.
Sorry. Another area, or key component of NBTN, or NCARB by the numbers, I should say, is insight into the sort of health of the profession. So what is happening in terms of the number of architects across the country, and also the number of candidates who are transitioning from working towards license to actually becoming licensed. I think this has been a really sort of important sort of data area for us, because if we go back a few years, I think there was a lot of concern in the profession around sort of the retirement of baby boomers, and the fact that there was a concern that the number of architects was going to reduce, that the pipeline to becoming the pipeline of future architects wasn't deep enough to sort of match that retirement level. And actually what we've seen at NCARB is that's not actually been the case. We haven't seen a sort of dramatic reduction in the number of architects across the US. It's currently about just over 120,000. And also with that 120,000 architects, there's also 136 reciprocal licenses. So that's obviously, I'm sure everyone's familiar with that, but I'll just for sake of clarification, that means that I'm licensed in multiple states. So you do the math on that. It means that typically every architect has, or the average architect, let's say, has just over 2 licenses for and therefore can work and practice in 2 jurisdictions. We also are interested very much in the pipeline. So currently we've got 32,622 candidates actively working towards licensure. That was the 2021 data set. And I'll just clarify that. So NCARB by the numbers, we say it's an annual publication. It is. We do a calendar year data set. So when we're talking about these kind of sort of whole numbers, big numbers, we're really looking at a full calendar year of activity and trying to frame that. And that allows us to then track and chart change over time and compare and see what's moved compared to previous years.
And then another thing that is in NCARB numbers that we have mentioned a little bit briefly is kind of an overlap between our programs and the profession at large, which is in the area of demographics and attrition along the path to licensure. So how differences in growth or lack of growth in diversity in our licensure candidate population impacts the diversity of the profession as a whole, and how demographic information impacts attrition along the path to licensure is another thing that we share in NCARB by the numbers. And we have our first question while we're talking about what's in NCARB by the numbers, which is from Andre. Is NCARB an advocate of taking the alternative path to licensure without a NAB degree? And are the numbers of people taking this path published in NCARB by the numbers?
I can give a start to that answer at least. So we do have data on people that participate in these alternate paths. We have not historically seen kind of like the threshold of participation where we can be able to sort of like report the numbers without, sort of accidentally identifying anybody because this volume is small, or, making sure that we have enough data to kind of draw from for analytics. But it is something that kind of every year we check in on and say like, okay, well, how are we looking at these different paths to licensure? And, do we have some volume here where we might be able to bring it into NBTN? So it's something that, speaking on the data side, we do keep an eye on and are eager to start, being able to report some numbers there. I think Andy can probably talk a little bit more to the advocacy piece.
Yeah, and I think that the question about sort of the advocacy aspect from NCARB is one where, as an organization, we have historically promoted a NAB degree. We still see that as a really valuable element of getting licensed, but we also acknowledge that there are other opportunities or other avenues for people to sort of fulfill the educational requirement for licensure, and not that we're necessarily walking away from the NAB degree. I think we understand that it's healthy, it does its job. What we're saying is there's some other areas which we want to strengthen and explore, because there's a whole conversation around the access, equity, cost implications of getting to licensure, and we as an organization want to make sure that we are supporting sort of multiple ways of getting to licensure.
Okay, and now I think we'll move into what are some of the highlights in this year's edition of NCARB by the numbers.
Yes. Okay. So I'll talk about this chart a little bit. So this was one of the new charts that we designed for this year. We kind of touched a little bit on, we are using NCARB by the numbers, not just to look at, the current snapshot, current status, but we also want to be able to track change and ideally progress, right? So we want to see how these trends are shifting as we look at them year on year. And so with the exam pass rates in NBTN originally, we sort of just reported the overall pass rates on the different divisions. Starting last year, with NBTN for 2021, we did a big deep dive into the pass rate data and we disaggregated it, which is a fancy data word for broke it down by the different demographics. So race, ethnicity, gender, age, and we looked at how those different groups performed on each division and how that compared. And so it was kind of a big moment for us, a big share. And then we really wanted to keep that conversation going and talk about what changed from the moment where we shared that data to the data that we were looking at for NBTN this year. And so we designed this chart specifically to look at that shift. So what we're seeing here is specifically for the practice management division. And we're looking at the race ethnicity groupings along the vertical axis. We're seeing in the gray dot, that was the pass rate on this division when we reported the data last year. And then the green dot is the pass rate currently. So this gave us an ability to say not just what the pass rates were by group at a given point in time, but also are they getting better? Are they changing at all? We kind of hope that the gray dot will be on the left and the green dot will be on the right. But we're looking at that, change and tracking it on an annual basis. So it was actually really difficult to find a good way to pack so much information into one chart, but we like a challenge. And we figured this was a good way to really talk or support the narrative we're trying to look for around talking about change and progress around the programs in the path to licensure. So I was a big fan of this chart.
And before you move off that chart, Catherine, I just want to sort of support that sentiment and say, again, we're talking about NCARB by the numbers, and we can frame it as a publication, which feels a little stagnant to me sometimes. But this kind of data set, and this is a great example of it, is a really important data set for us as an organization. We have multiple efforts to try and address and improve or mitigate, let's say, the disparities that we've seen in pass rates in the exam by race ethnicity. So for us to have the ability to track it, the ability to see how various efforts and other actions that we take impact this data set. And we understand that it's not something that's sort of, there's no magic wand or overnight fix, but if we can keep eyes on this and we have a way of really keeping, reporting back to ourselves on progress, it's hugely helpful, and it really helps us track the impact of decisions, but also make the decisions on the front end. I think that's really important. Okay, and sticking with that theme of sort of this year's highlights, and again, that sort of tracking change over time, this chart, again, it's a new visual for this year, but we're really talking about the sort of the change in the profile, in the sort of demographic profile of that cohort of individuals who are getting licensed. Now, what we've done in this chart is actually we've kind of changed the comparison set a little bit. So we've done a 5-year look back. In the spirit of acknowledging the fact that things don't change hugely, and it takes a lot to see, it takes time for change to be manifest. We wanted to do a 5-year look back in comparison on this change, just to make sure that the efforts that we've made over the previous years are really, we're seeing gains or improvements in the diversity profile of new licensed architects. And what we've seen is that actually over that time frame between 2021 and 2017, we have seen a shift. The number of white candidates becoming licensed has dropped by about 6%. We've seen gains in the number of Hispanic and Latino and Asian candidates specifically getting licensed. Other groups, and again, we realize that there are more demographic breakdowns, available and there. I will say that one of the reasons we have other groups is really about quantifying numbers and making sure that we're able to have that sort of aggregated data. And we just, if we have small sample sizes, we just can't do it fairly. But then Black or African American candidates has increased slightly, but it's only 0.4%. And I think that's a big topic for us. It's a big topic for the profession as well. Progress is good, but it'd be great to see a little bit more in terms of helping our African American and Black peers get to licensure. So, remains a sort of an important data point for us going forward.
All right, we have a couple of related questions to tackle before we move on to the next slide. So, first one is, how does the demographic breakdown of the licensed architect population compare to the overall US population? I love this question because we talk about this a lot.
Yes, so we do. And I think we have a chart in NCARB by the numbers that touches on this, but we do kind of compare. So we can pull census data, right? That's publicly available. So we can take a look at the US Census and see, how that breakdown looks. And we can compare it not just to our population in general, but we can kind of further get into licensure candidates versus architects versus cert holders. And so I think it's an excellent question, because having that context that goes beyond just our corner of the universe here at NCARB is really important, so that we can talk about our trends that we're seeing and any progress that we're making in the context of, what it looks like kind of writ large as a society. So excellent data instincts from that question asker.
And the follow-up question is, are there obvious deviations? And I will say, I think one of the big ones is, if you look at the Census Bureau data for the US population, Black or African-American people make up about 13% of the US population. They only make up about 2% of licensed architects in the United States. So I think that's the biggest gap that we see when comparing the population of architects back to the population of the US. Our next similar question is, do we have charts that break down not just by gender, but also, or not just by race and ethnicity, but also race, ethnicity, and gender?
Yes, so we do. And just like Andy said, maybe not necessarily encouraging folks to split their attention and go to the website, but if you go to the microsite that has all of these charts, we designed quite a few of them this year to actually be interactive. So what you're seeing on this screen is one version of the chart looking at, a particular demographic. But if you go to it on the website, you can actually toggle it to say, I want to see race, ethnicity, or I want to see gender or age, or look at the intersectionality of those. So we tried to kind of pack a lot of interaction in so that folks can actually explore and play with the data.
Okay, great. So on to our next thing. So what's in this year's NCARB in the numbers? In addition to those new charts that Andy and Catherine highlighted this year, we also have something that we brought back from last year, which is a highlight of how COVID-19 pandemic impacted the path to licensure and the architecture profession. So it's a month-by-month breakdown of a lot of key metric points for us, like the number of people completing the exam and the experience program, and the number of people who are kind of getting ready to get a license, like have met all of the major requirements, as well as like the number of people asking for out-of-state licensure applications. So it's a month-by-month breakdown where you can compare it to the same month for 2020 data, as well as the kind of 3-year average that we saw prior to the pandemic. So the average of 2017 to 2019. So for us, that is an important way of kind of looking to where we're seeing recovery from the pandemic and where we might see some long-term impacts that could impact the number of architects, the licensure candidate pipeline for years to come. And then additionally, in NCARB by the numbers this year is some good information about stability in the profession at large. So we've seen a pretty stable number of licensed architects in the United States. It didn't decline this year despite the pandemic. And we've seen a continued high demand for out-of-state licensure applications. So mobility continues to be really important, and that's a good sign to us. And the time to licensure has stayed pretty stable. It didn't really go up or down this year, which is also a good sign given the number of other things happening in the world in 2021.
Okay, also talking about some highlights. So we look at, and I think Andy, you mentioned this a little earlier, but we do look at the attrition from the path. So candidates that start a record and begin making progress towards their license, but don't stay on the path and complete that process. And so this is, we sort of accept that perhaps not 100% of candidates that open a record will eventually get licensed, but it's still a real big area of focus for us to kind of figure out, well, where and how are we losing people along the path? And is that sort of equal across all groups, or are we seeing any one group that's disproportionately affected somewhere on the path? So there's a number of different charts and pieces of research that go into understanding this attrition piece that are all in NCARB by the numbers. This infographic designed by our marketing and communication friends kind of packages a lot of them up together really nicely. And you can kind of get a sense of what we're seeing around trends for staying on the path. So like 64% of all candidates stay on the path. And then we can see that that breaks down almost roughly equally amongst candidates of color, but then white candidates are a little bit more likely to stay on the path. And we also see that women are slightly more likely to stay on the path than men. So these are some of the things that we look into when we're talking about staying on versus leaving the path to licensure. And then this obviously also ties into some of our other work. For example, with the joint study we did with NOMA, the National Organization of Minority Architects. This was a survey that we did in 2019, and we've been releasing findings from. And that information is heavy on the experiential side. It gives us real feedback from the candidates that are experiencing these programs, this path to licensure. And so we can kind of take that quantitative, yes, experiential qualitative data that we have from the survey, and then look at it in the context of our programs and see if we can kind of paint the bigger picture between the two data sets. Data is always all about context, right? Like as much information as you can have to kind of flesh out the full picture. So this is a big area of focus for us in NCARB by the numbers, but also at NCARB in general.
And Catherine, I just want to, there's a couple of points on that slide, actually, just to touch on. So 64% of all candidates staying on path to licensure over a 10-year period, and that sort of would take us back to sort of 2012. And the other point just to worth highlight is bottom right, women, 65% of women stay on path, 64% of men. I think some people have asked questions of us and said, you know, what happened to the gender conversation, NCARB? We don't seem to hear as much about, the male versus female challenges as opposed to race ethnicity parameters being impactful. And the answer to that is, well, actually, since 2012, we haven't seen a disparity when we just look at a straight sort of gender separation, female to male. So women are staying on the path now as effectively as actually slightly higher frequency than men. So I think that going back to the previous question we were asked, which was about the interrelationship between gender and race ethnicity, is really where that conversation now sort of focuses. On the next slide, we dig in a little bit more into this, and this is one of those kind of attrition visuals. It's actually in the section. This is looking at, this particular data set is looking at 2007 to 2011. That seems like we're going back an awful long way, but given the time to licensure, this is just one view. If you go to the NBTN site, you'll be able to see a number of views of this. There's also sort of 2012 to 2016. And really what we're doing here is saying, okay, we're looking at not just how people are getting through, but also where we're losing them. This is a really important question for us to ask is, okay, great, we're keeping X amount of people on the path to licensure. And if we start at the bottom and sort of work our way up, people who are still on the path, 10 plus years later, of those people who started an NCARB record in that time window, you can see the proportion of individuals from these demographics that actually became architects, bottom row, are still actively working towards licensure, which is the sort of second one up. And then the top section, those sort of 4 rows there, are really looking into where are we losing people. This is a really important question for us to ask as an organization. You know, are we seeing, especially when it comes to DI efforts within our work, you know, are there particular pain points that we can identify that will allow us further explore and lead us to hopefully some solutions? What we see is there's some interesting patterns, and I won't try and call all of them out there, but I'll just say one thing. You know, before starting NCARB programs, as that very top line, so that's people who've started a record maybe at college and never got to the point where they actually recorded experience in AXP. They never took an exam. We almost debated whether we need to include that, but we said, no, we do, because when you start an NCARB record, you're signaling your intention at that point in time to say, I'm interested in becoming licensed. So even if you really make very little progress, we really want to understand what that is and why that might, what causal factors might be in that drop off. And you can see there that as there is some big differentials in that top line and elsewhere too. But great level of insight. And this kind of data set really has led us to do a lot more exploration and, quite frankly, think about some sort of program adaptations to try and help address some of these issues.
And when we're talking about addressing these issues and disparities and staying on the path to licensure, one of the questions we've gotten is, what specifically is being done to increase the number of Black architects? Which is a great question. It's one that definitely expands beyond just NCARB. But yeah. I don't know if either one of you want to start.
Well, I would start by saying there's a couple of aspects there, right? So first, for us as at NCARB, our responsibility is to say, look, we look at our programs and we say, do we have are there differentials? Are we seeing disparities in how people are getting through our programs? And the reality is we have seen differentials. It's taking Black and African American candidates longer to get through the path to licensure. You can see from this chart that there's some big differentials in terms of how the proportion of candidates over a 10-year period who've actually got to that point where they're being licensed. So absolutely, there's an onus on us to explore, to understand why that might be, and think about what changes we might be able to make to offset some of these differentials. There's another question, which is not just an NCARB question. I'm not saying that it's not our space to answer this. I think we have a part to play, but we know that other organizations are also interested in it, which is the awareness of architecture as a profession, accessibility early. And when I say early, we're talking about K through 12, of just exposure to architecture. And there's a number of initiatives being led by NOMA, AIA, ourselves involved, that are helping do more work in that space. So I think it's a combination of those two things: awareness and then obviously support along the path are the two things that are going to make the difference over time.
Excellent. All right, moving on to our next slide. So we're talking about NCARB the numbers, and Andy said earlier, we want it to be a resource to you, not just to us. So how can you use NCARB by the numbers? And I think part of it is understanding how you fit into, where you fit into the average, like looking at the average. How do you fit into that space? And how can you take advantage of the information that we share in NCARB by the numbers to make informed decisions for yourself and your own career path? So one of the charts that I think is a great example of this is one we added this year, which is this chart on the screen. So there's a lot of information here, so I'll break it down quickly. So most of you hopefully know that the areas of the AXP align to the divisions of the ARE. So one of the things that we have been tracking since we made that change so that the exam and the experience program were aligned is how that's impacting candidates' success. So on this, you can see the exam divisions on the left of the chart going down, and you can see AXP progress on the top going across. And that is specifically AXP progress in the same experience area. So you can see how candidates tend to do, like what their success rate is on the exam based on how much experience they have completed in the same experience area. And when you look at this chart, you can see overwhelmingly the candidates are most successful in that 75 to 99% AXP complete bar. That is highest across the divisions, I think. So if you're a candidate and you're wondering when you should take the exam, you can look at this and say, you can make your own decision based on your needs, but you can see that candidates overall are more successful when they're in that space, and maybe you can plan your exam path around that, and you can help other people advocate for themselves to get the experience that they need in those areas so that they too can be set up for success.
Similarly, when we talk about, sort of seeing yourself in NCARB by the numbers, or even if you're not a licensure candidate necessarily, but you're somebody who might be in a supervisor role or mentoring candidates or otherwise working with aspiring architects, we, as Jenny said, so we do kind of report a lot of the high level things as either like an average, or we specifically use median. A brief note on that. So when we look at, the full set of values, oftentimes there's kind of a handful that are, very, very low, and then kind of a long tail sometimes. And so what we do is we pick what's called the median, which is the middle of the data set. And that kind of helps control for some of those really extreme values. So average can be either the median or the mean. We go with median usually. But setting aside my data wonk hat for a moment. So this chart that Jenny has up here on the screen gives a sense of, like, when we talk about the average time to complete a program, this is actually what that kind of breakdown looks like in real life for all the candidates. So we get a sense of, not just this is that average number that, one size fits most kind of thing, but here's actually how those candidates break down in the different buckets. So we can see in this top one, the proportion of candidates that are completing the experience program a little bit faster than the average or a little bit slower than the average. And then on the lower chart, we can see the same, but for the exam. So we can see that, roughly a third of the candidates are completing the exam in 2 years or less. And there's kind of another third sort of in the middle, and then another third at the end. So this helps kind of illustrate that there's, maybe there's one sort of call out number that you might see as a headline, but we recognize that there's really kind of a wide range of experiences here on the path to licensure. And we want to kind of illustrate that while there's an average number, it doesn't necessarily mean that's everyone's number. So you don't necessarily have to judge yourself just against that one. You can find yourself wherever you are in the data set.
Okay, so that is the end of our slide deck, but we have a lot of questions. So feel free, if you have questions, pop them in that Q&A tool. We're going to get to as many as we can. We have about 20 minutes left. So one of the first ones that we've gotten is there an effort to incorporate past years of pass rate data by race or ethnicity or gender so that we can see more of the history as well as where we're going in the future?
Yeah, so the chart that we looked at that had the kind of gray dot, green dot showing that shift, that the gray dot actually represented like all exams prior to that date. So it kind of sort of gives a sense of the history, but it doesn't break it out for you. So we do have some of the other charts that are in NCARB by the numbers that track that pass rate over time. We also still have, I think, at least 1 year, if not a couple of archived NBTNs on the website if you're interested in going back through the previous versions of the charts. But at least I can say that when we look at them internally, we are looking at usually 10 years of data as we consider the trend and figuring out what the story in the chart is.
Just to clarify, add to that, if I could, Catherine, when you said all years, I think really we're talking since the advent of ARE 5.0. So it was really a sort of 5. So going from sort of 5.0, and yep, if we didn't have the filters in place prior to that, which we didn't, we aren't able to go back to 4.0 and do a comparison set there. But we were able to take a sort of really 3.5 year, I think, where we got through that transitionary phase, and we had everybody in the same doing the same exam. People weren't doing sort of the hybrid model where you, for those who remember it, you could do, those certain ways of doing it differently, and that gave us the benchmark, right? So we were able to get that sort of 3-year benchmark and say, from a race ethnicity perspective, this is out where we start from. This is what we're seeing, and I think that was a really important moment for us to say, okay, now we all understood there was going to be disparity. We hadn't quantified it, but I think the data that was put out last year did quantify it. I think it was, quite frankly, some of the levels of difference were pretty big and shocking, quite frankly. And we were like, oh my gosh, this is there's a long way to go to see parity in the space. But now we can move from there. Now we can track it, and now we can see the hopefully the actions sort of manifest in the data as we go forward.
Okay. Next question is, do we have data to share about candidates who speak or read English as a second language?
Yeah, so we launched that accommodation at the beginning of the summer. So we're still kind of in the early stages of it being available for candidates to use. We did do some research, obviously, and we were kind of designing that accommodation to figure out, while we were trying to, what would be most helpful. And so we did some work around figuring out what proportion of our candidate pool might benefit from an accommodation and what accommodation might make the most sense. I don't think that any of those figures are in NCARB by the numbers, but I'd be happy to chat more about what we saw there. Andy, if you want to add to that maybe at all.
Yeah, it's a good question, because it sort of highlights the limitation, if you will, of the demographic filters that we've traditionally gathered. So I'll give an example. We've recently been doing a project with NOMA called Baseline Belonging, and we went out and we surveyed several thousand individuals to get their experiences in and around our programs. And there was a couple of additional filters that we asked about. We asked about firm size, which is something that NCARB traditionally has not recorded. And we also dug into sort of age in a different way than we have in the past from our organization's perspective. And we realized that those two demographic parameters had a big difference. We hadn't, prior to doing that work with NOMA, we hadn't really had a very big conversation about age as it impacted candidates. Maybe there's a stereotype of candidates being sort of, recent graduate for whatever reason, but it's one of those actions that then sort of brings questions back to us and says, maybe we want a little bit more nuance in the data options that we collect. And it goes back, yes, all this demographic data is self-reported and voluntary. So we don't want to be overbearing in what we ask for, but having detailed demographic information from our record holders really does help us track and chart these kind of trends and hopefully inform decision making by our organization.
Okay. Another exam question is, do we plan on collecting and releasing data on pass rates comparing PSI and Prometric?
So I mean, the exams did not necessarily change between the two vendors other than who was delivering them, but we do still, we're always keeping tabs on our pass rates. So if we did see something that looked like it was a shift when we migrated from Prometric to PSI, that would certainly be something that would float to the top in our analysis, but I don't think we're expecting to see a change there.
Well, you have many tools at your disposal, Catherine. You may be able to do it. I will just add that that's not the only change that's happened in and around that time frame. As an organization, we also made the English as a second language accommodation available, and we also launched the 6 practice exams, which are available through my NCARB, which we really hope that those are going to have a big impact and make a difference to pass rates. That's what we want to see. We hope to see it, and time will tell. But there are other things in and around that time frame. So you would work your magic on whether you can sort of disseminate PSI cleanly from Prometric in that space, Catherine. But I know there's multiple factors at play that we're looking into to see if it makes a difference.
Yeah, I think definitely the practice exams being launched is something that we're really excited to start, not just, excited to see the impact on our candidate community, but also to be able to kind of quantify that and see, a lot of work went into these. Are they having, an effect on these exam data points that we look at? So I look forward to these.
Okay. And we have a long question about the number of licensed architects and the overall stability of the profession. So we mentioned earlier that the number of architects was pretty stable in 2021 compared to 2022. But we have typically been seeing growth year over year. So are we talking about the number of new architects has stabilized, or the number of overall architects has stabilized? And should we be concerned that we're really seeing a plateau and not growth? There's a lot to unpack there.
Well, it's from NCARB's perspective, it's not like we don't necessarily have a expectation or political drive to say we need more architects, right? There's commercial factors at play that's going to determine the marketplace and the profession. We are obviously interested in making sure that the path to get there is equitable, fair, and reasonable. I think that what we did see when it came to the impact of COVID wasn't so much on the architect side. Kind of, if you're already an architect, maybe there's a resiliency in your business and where you are in your career. What we did see was a big change a big impact in the number of candidates who, shall we say, new record holder creations. So that's people who are at school who may be thinking about getting their early experience and want to record it. We did see a drop off in that space, and also in the amount of AXP hours recorded, certainly through the first sort of 6-8 months, maybe a year of COVID. So yeah, for us, the question is, what's the bounce back for that? And actually that section, Jenny, you referred to the section, there is some insight into that. We have seen it recovery, and it's certainly getting back there, but I don't think yet we're back to pre-pandemic levels in terms of the AXP and in terms of hours. So that's really where I think COVID impacted most, was early experience.
All right, we have gotten several similar questions about the value of licensure and DEI in the profession. So in terms of encouraging greater diversity in the profession, what can we do to help people from underrepresented groups better understand the value of licensure, and also help them achieve licensure?
Andy's clearly in thought. So I think, Andy kind of touched on this a little bit earlier when we were talking about baseline on belonging and increasing the number of Black architects specifically. But I think the kind of the recommendation there holds in other circumstances too, where there's kind of an awareness need. So we have a lot of initiatives and work focused this year on outreach. Just to kind of go a little into the weeds maybe on this answer. So we looked at, for this, for those who aren't aware, there's a 2030 goal from the Large Firm Roundtable and from NOMA to double the number of Black or African American architects in the profession. So in kind of looking into this, we looked at, what do we have currently, and what trends do we see in terms of people getting licensed, and what does that look like by 2030? And then what we can do is see like whether those trends are more sensitive to certain factors than others. I promise I'm a roundabout way of getting back to the question. But so what we saw was, we put a lot of focus on attrition from the path and understanding it, and certainly supporting candidates so that they don't leave the path if they don't want to. But we saw that there is kind of a staying power of candidates, like, on the path, kind of tend to stick with it. But the projections were very sensitive to new candidates coming in, which kind of supported our kind of gut instinct that there is this need for awareness and outreach and recruiting people into the path and helping them understand the value and the importance of getting a license if they're going to be working in the architecture, world sort of writ large. So there's very long-winded way of kind of coming back to the question at hand. But yeah, I think awareness and outreach are big areas of focus for us currently.
And if I'll add to that a little bit. So Andy mentioned our baseline on belonging study with NOMA earlier. And one of the things we've seen in the responses is a lot of people asking, what is the benefit of licensure, in a lot of the open text responses. And so what we've seen, we asked a question in the survey, and this is from the report that will be coming out in the next couple months. So this is a bit of a spoiler. I hope you'll forgive me. So one of the things we've seen is when we ask people about what benefits they received after licensure, we asked them if they got a raise after they got licensed, if they got a promotion, if they had access to new work opportunities. And one of the things that we saw is that white men in general were much more likely to say that they got those material benefits after licensure. So if you are in a position in your firm where you have some control over that, I think this is a shout out to you to make sure that people are seeing the benefits of licensure and that it's not just one group of people who's seeing those benefits, but that it is equal opportunity across your firm and across your candidates. Right. Our next question. Have we dug into the percentage of people who are falling off the path to licensure due to the rolling clock?
Oh, yes, excellent question. So we've done a little bit of work here. What's interesting is, like Andy mentioned, right now, a lot of the exam data is focused on ARE 5.0. So we're kind of just starting to enter the window where those 5.0 divisions would start to expire, since it's been about 5 years since we launched, plus we had some extensions to the rolling clock due to COVID. So this is probably something that in the next iteration of NCARB by the numbers, or at least in the coming year, we'll be talking more about. We can look at it kind of historically for ARE 4.0, of course, but we try with NCARB by the numbers to focus on, the trends at hand and the current experiences that we're seeing. So there's a temptation to kind of dig further and further back, but we try to kind of stick to what's current and topical. So I think looking further into the rolling clock is going to be a big area of focus as we start entering the window where ARE 5 divisions would be expiring.
Okay, we're coming up close on time, so this might be one of our last questions. Talking about average ages, what is the average age for candidates when they first start their NCARB record? What's the average age at exam success?
Admittedly, Jenny often is much better at memorizing the numbers on the charts than I am. It might be like a data overload issue. I know these numbers exist in NCARB by the numbers, but you want to try a pop quiz, Jenny?
Yeah, oh, Andy, go for it.
Oh,
well, I was going to say, starting the record, I can't remember offhand. I think we're at 33.1 years or around about that 33 for exam completion.
Yeah, I think 32 to 33 exam success. I think the average age to start your record, it does vary some based on race and ethnicity. I think white candidates are more likely to start younger than candidates of other races and ethnicities, but it's between like 25 to 26 is average. And a follow-up question on that is, what is the proportion of exam candidates who are over 40?
Andy, do you want to take that one? It is.
I feel like I'd just be picking a number.
I think I can actually pull that one up really quickly. Well, I can tell you. Hold on.
20%. Guess.
It's very close. It is 19.4% in 2020.
I guess. Yeah.
Good job.
Excellent work. Okay. So we have about 5 minutes left. So I think it is probably time for us to start wrapping up. We do have a lot of great questions. So if you have questions we didn't answer, I encourage you to email us at communications@ncarb.org. But in the meantime, I'd like our panelists here to share their key takeaway about NCARB by the numbers before we close. So Catherine, do you want to start?
I can go first. I'm also going to break the rules. Instead of a takeaway, I have an ask. So I think, thank you, all of you, for joining us, and giving us an hour of your time today. We've given you just, if you weren't familiar with NCARB by the numbers before, we've barely scratched the surface of what's in there. I would love to hear from anyone and everyone, what do you think of the charts? Do they make sense? Are there other things you'd like us to look at? Any and all feedback. This is a project like, we've been doing it for a while, and we love coming up with new things to look at. And there's so many, good questions out there. So my takeaway is that I am personally interested in hearing from folks about what they might like to see in NCARB by the numbers.
Okay, Andy.
Oh dear, kind of stole mine, but it's I think for me it's well, yeah, Catherine, I mean, the point Catherine makes, I just want to reinforce it, quite frankly, is, every year we have a conversation. It's in a conversation we enjoy, but we sit down and we say, okay, what do we do? What questions now are sort of, what are the new questions that we now need to explore? What's it going to take for us to explore them? And how can we, shall we say, offer some more insight, not just for us, but for the profession at large into what's happening in and around the profession. So any questions, comments that you can share with us on that space is really helpful. And will help us when we come to the next year, sort of December time, we'll be sitting down and saying, right, what we're doing, where we're going, what's new. We want to be able to bring these challenges, quite frankly, to our group and saying, hey, what about this? Can we get there? Can we do it? So please feel free to be challenging to us in terms of what you think we need to explore.
Okay. And I'll say my key takeaway, I hope you take away, is if you're a licensure candidate, use NCARB by the numbers to advocate for yourself at your firm. Use that information to highlight areas where you can ask your firm leadership for support, or you can offer support to your peers. And if you are a supervisor or you're a firm leader, look at NCARB by the numbers and look at ways that you can support your candidates in giving them the tools and the resources that they need to succeed along the path to licensure. We do our best to provide all the resources we can, but NCARB can't do it alone. And yeah, that's my takeaway for you today. So we got a lot of great questions that we didn't get to. So again, you can email us at communications@ncarb.org, or you can tweet at us or whatever. And we would love to answer your questions about NCARB by the numbers. So thank you all for joining us today, and have a great rest of your afternoon.
Thank you, Jenny, for facilitating us with questions.
Indeed. Thank you.
Bye, everybody.